Okay, great. And we're recording. So let's get started. So we're going to be talking about Ayurvedic nutrition and specifically talking about the Panchamahabhautic composition of vegetables. Now, what do we mean by Panchamahabhautic? Panchamahabhautic simply means that we are looking at things according to the perspective of the Panchamahabhut in Sankhya philosophy, the 5 major elemental categories. So everything, everything in this world, our doshas, our prakriti, our vikriti, the different types of foods that we eat, everything has a balance or a composition, a connection with these 5 elemental categories, the Panchamahabhuta. So we talk about the Panchamahabhutic composition of vegetables and fruits and spices and grains and so forth. It's a very important topic. And understanding this allows you to use these things in a sensible way to balance our prakriti, because, you know, remember that that's the goal in Ayurveda, is to find the balance. Balance means that we have our digestion is working properly, our elimination is working properly, and the doshas are in balance as well. So we'll talk about vegetables from the Ayurvedic perspective, and what's the composition and what types of options that you might have for dual doshas. This same presentation, which we'll cover in another lecture, will cover grains and legumes and oils. So we're just going to cover vegetables. I have a couple of cooking videos that have some demonstration of ways to prepare vegetables. So one very important thing, when we talk about nutrition in Ayurveda, when we talk about things, we're talking about vegetables here. This is the dravya. This is the the ingredient, and the way that we prepare it has an effect. So we can transform something. Let's say, for example, that there's a vegetable that is, that has a lot of kapha in it. So potatoes, for example, potatoes are already very earthy. But if we roast them or bake them, we're introducing some vata and some pitta. We're introducing some fire and air when we dry roast, or if we even roast something with a little bit of oil or ghee. We're actually transforming it. But the dravya, the substance is important, and in the cooking videos, we'll talk a little bit about some of the techniques. So, vegetables from an Ayurvedic perspective. In general, vegetables are sattvic, so that means that they will tend to balance the mind and the body. You want to harvest vegetables when they're ripe, when they're high in pran. You should avoid having veggies that are harvested too early and artificially ripened. Now, this is very important. This is the ideal. So it doesn't mean that if you can't follow the ideal, you're not going to have any value. It's just that the maximum value, so the absolute maximum value would be, let's say you have a little organic garden in the backyard and you grow your own veggies, and you basically, I'm ready to cook something. I'm going to go outside. I'll cut it right off the vine or off the plant. I'm going to, wash it, cook it, and then I'm going to have it right away. That is going to give you the maximum benefit, the maximum pran. You're going to get the maximum energetic potential from it. And it's really very simple. This is the old way. This is the traditional way that people would eat. There wasn't, fast food, prepared food. convenience, fast food, everything is very convenient because we have so much pressure and so little time nowadays. But when people took more time to prepare their food and even more time to eat, they were generally more healthy. So different categories. We're going to talk about root vegetables. We'll talk about leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables, pungent vegetables, nightshades, and diuretics. So these are just different categories that we'll discuss. So let's talk about root vegetables. What are some examples of root vegetables? You have carrots, parsnips, turnips, potatoes, and except in the case of allergies to nightshades, there's yam, yucca, and artichokes. I'm sorry, this is actually Jerusalem artichokes, not the flower artichokes. And Jerusalem artichokes are actually a different type of root vegetable. So these will generally be vata pacifying. They were going to be pitta balancing, pitta neutral, and they will tend to increase kapha somewhat. So remember, I mentioned that the way that you prepare root vegetables, if you are trying to not increase kapha, you might choose more roasting options. You know, for example, grilling vegetables is another thing that may also somewhat reduce the kapha increasing nature. Root vegetables are primarily earthy. They have a predominance of earth element. So they have nourishing and grounding qualities. And they're going to be excellent for grounding vata. So if vata is going a little crazy, having a little bit more of root vegetables in the diet is going to be good. And when we have root vegetables, they're generally going to be had cooked. Now, there are some exceptions. There is one vegetable which is popular, jicama, that is available in many grocery stores in the US, pretty much anywhere that has a substantial Hispanic population, you'll find this. It's very similar to a popular root vegetable in India, which is called in Bengal shakar aloo. And it's actually a root vegetable that can be eaten raw, like carrots. It's very tasty. It has a slightly nutty flavor. Eating too much of it can give you a little bit of indigestion, but it can be eaten raw like carrots. It's actually very tasty, and it can also be cooked. Generally, root vegetables are going to be cooked, and that's what we're talking about here. The way that you cook them can also have an effect on what their Panchamahabhautic properties are. So root vegetables are tonics. They will build and nourish the dhatus. They are, not just something that's nourishing, but they are also grounding, and they also have a tonic action. So they will help to build and nourish dhatus. In the West, people tend to have a real fixation on protein, and sometimes people use that as an excuse for not having a primarily plant-based diet. But the fact is that we actually get a lot of nutrition from vegetables. Vegetables are a very important part of our diet. Root vegetables will usually increase kapha. They have that, K+, they are the kapha increasing. That's part of their property. So, cooking roots. So for vata, you would want to use ghee and warming vata spices like cinnamon, hing, turmeric, ginger, cumin, and coriander. This will be very vata balancing. Again, it's something that we sometimes run into. We have people come in for a consultation They are vata, and they're going to tend toward cold things. Why? Because it's a cultural thing in America. People tend to only want to get thinner and thinner, no matter how thin you are to start with. And that's actually not balancing. It's not really going to be healthy. For a vata person, it's good to have more cooked things, more warm things, and also to use warming spices and to use ghee. Ghee has the ability to carry especially these warming spices and some of these very healing spices like turmeric and ginger, to carry these to the tissues of the body where they actually can have an anti-inflammatory effect. So if you want to get benefit from turmeric, turmeric can be chemically analyzed to have a lot of very useful anti-inflammatory properties and properties that help to prevent various types of disorders, even cancer. But you need something that helps to carry the properties of turmeric to the tissues of the body, and ghee is excellent for that. So, for vata, cooked things are going to be good. Warming things are going to be good. Root vegetables will be really good for vata. And these are some spices that can be used: cinnamon, hing, turmeric, ginger, cumin, coriander. Now, cooking root vegetables for pitta, one would use ghee or maybe cold-pressed coconut oil, and some milder pitta spices like cumin, coriander, and fennel. Coriander is one spice that tends to be very tridoshic. It has a somewhat of a cooling virya. I always recommend keeping whole coriander seeds, and then if you have a little coffee grinder, one of those little electric coffee grinders that you can pick up for 20 bucks at Walmart, those actually work really well. Or a good blender will do a good job. And always grind fresh coriander. Try to grind it once a week and not keep it longer than a week or so. Try to make enough so that you can use it up within a week. Fresh ground coriander, it adds an amazing aroma. It's very balancing and it's cooling, and it's great for pitta. So cumin, coriander, fennel. Fennel is another spice that will tend to help to calm down, especially if you have a little bit of acid, perhaps some excess acid. Fennel is actually very good. It's very cooling and calming. For kapha prakriti, one would cook with warming spices like turmeric, ginger, and cinnamon, but use just a little less ghee or oil. And you also might use some techniques that introduce a bit more vata. So techniques that are good for kapha might include things like grilling, roasting, baking. So you can, for example, put veggies on a pan and put a little bit of olive oil or ghee, sprinkle them lightly with salt and some spices, and roast them in the oven. Especially if you have a convection oven, that's going to tend to give more of it's going to dry them just a little bit. It is going to reduce the kapha increasing properties. These are just general principles that you can think about. Now, what if you were cooking for dual dosha? So someone, let's say, is vata kapha. You can use warming spices, but you might use the root vegetables sparingly so as not to aggravate kapha. So, for example, you might make some carrot soup to go along with other things. That'll be good. So what about leafy greens and cruciferous vegetables? So some examples of leafy greens: spinach, kale, collard greens, chard. There's Swiss chard, there's red chard and green chard and even purple chard. There are just so many varieties of leafy greens. The cruciferous vegetables, there are all these cruciferous vegetables that we're familiar with, and now there's some exotic things like you can get orange cauliflower and purple cauliflower. but they're all cruciferous. There's cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, and cabbage. Those are the basic ones, basic cruciferous. They tend to be a little bit astringent, and they have a little bit of bitter. So there's some astringent and some bitter in the rust. So that's why, maybe when you were a kid, you didn't like the taste. I didn't like the taste of cauliflower too much when I was a kid. Also, partly it was because my mom would use frozen cauliflower and boil it, and that's not the most appealing way to have it. Um, if you pan roast cauliflower with a little bit of oil, it actually it reduces somewhat of that bitterness, that slight bitterness and astringency, and makes it more balancing. It gives a little bit of sweetness to it. So that astringent and bitter rust, this is actually very good for pitta and kapha, but it's slightly vata aggravating. So cruciferous vegetables are really great. They're good for pitta and good for kapha. And if you're, pitta kapha like me, then the cruciferous vegetables are definitely going to be a great thing to have every day on your plate. These cruciferous and leafy vegetables will also help to cleanse Rakta Dhatu. Cruciferous veggies are natural anti-inflammatories. They help the liver and the lymph system, the lymphatic system, do a better job of detoxification. And there's also substantial research pointing to the cancer-reducing properties of cruciferous veggies. It's amazing. There's been a lot of really good research, a lot of thorough peer-reviewed research that has come out, and people don't really hear about it. And there was a documentary on this recently, What the Health, and the documentary maker did a very good job exposing how some of these big associations are getting funding from the meat industry and other special interest groups, and they actually completely ignore the role of diet in preventing heart disease, diabetes, cancer. It's really very sad, but it's, as Ayurvedic practitioners, we can point to all the really good research. Exactly. We can point to some really great research that's out there that's really well presented, and books like the China study, for example. I mean, that's one of the most thorough research studies that involves hundreds of thousands of people, and it's very well presented. And not just specifically about the plant-based diet, but the role of cruciferous vegetables. So, these are all things that are very well established, and we don't really need to go into that. I would probably be mostly preaching to the choir, but the point is that this is the natural property of these vegetables. So they're really good things to have. One of the problems is that people sometimes just don't know what to do with it. That's something that we can help with. We can show just some very simple techniques, pan frying some vegetables with some spices, a little bit of ghee. People sometimes are afraid to use oil or ghee or butter in their cooking, and there's not really any need for that. Some of the big problems are a very big consumption of of fats in the diet. Eating fried things is very bad, but using a little bit of oil to help carry the rasa of spices in cooking vegetables is actually essential, and it's very beneficial. So, that's a little bit here on the cruciferous vegetables. So, if somebody needs detox, and for pittas, the Ranjaka pitta is in the liver and regulates liver function, they should have cruciferous veggies every day. There's no reason not to. But because these tend to be somewhat vata increasing, they should be steamed, stir-fried, or cooked in ghee to reduce vata. Having raw cruciferous vegetables, I know I've done this myself. You go to a salad bar, and there's some places that'll have a salad bar, and sometimes that's the plant-based option that you have available. So you go for the salad bar, and you can have raw cruciferous vegetables, but they will aggravate vata. That's a given. Um, and there are things like having raw cabbage, raw cauliflower, raw broccoli. We've all done that from time to time, but it will tend to give you some gas. It will aggravate vata. And if you are already vata prakriti, it's really not going to be recommended. So having steaming, stir frying, or cooking in ghee, this will help reduce the vata element. You can also mix cruciferous vegetables with sweet vegetables or root vegetables, and that will help to counteract the bitterness. You also want to use hing. Other things that help reduce the bitterness, coriander powder. Again, I mentioned coriander. Coriander powder is your friend. Not power. All right, yeah, coriander power, yay. Coriander powder, I meant to say. Coriander powder is your friend when you're cooking cruciferous vegetables. Use a little bit of cumin, use some turmeric, use some ginger, use a lot of coriander powder, and use hing, and you can't go wrong, okay? You can quote me on that. So I'll write it out here. So some cumin, ginger, fresh ginger, hing, turmeric, and let's say some black pepper, coriander powder. You can just, take it to the bank. You can put these in a pan, put the cumin in first in some hot ghee or olive oil, add your veggies, add the other powdered spices, and just with the lid, stir it a few times. The veggies are going to get nicely stir-fried, and they'll turn a little brown where they're in contact with the pan, and it's going to completely change the way, if you haven't done this before, it'll change the way you view cruciferous vegetables. I guarantee it. There are some cruciferous vegetables that tend to keep a little bit more, slightly more of the bitterness. Brussels sprouts are one. I love Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts are great, and but they have a little bit more of that slight bitterness of cruciferous vegetables. But if you do this with cauliflower or broccoli, even someone who doesn't like cauliflower or broccoli might just see it completely differently. Again, having cruciferous vegetables raw, that's a good thing for summertime. Otherwise, have it steamed or cooked. So what about pungent vegetables? What do we mean by pungent vegetables? So some examples of pungent vegetables: onions, cayenne peppers, red chilies, jalapeno peppers, habanero peppers, radishes, horseradish, wasabi. You don't usually see wasabi because it's actually fairly rare. People think it's horseradish. It's kind of a Japanese variety of horseradish, but wasabi is longer and it has more of a blue color, and it grows in mountain areas. Horseradish is fairly common. There's another radish. There's a couple of other radishes that I should mention also. There is daikon, which is also called muli in India. You can find that in Asian groceries, Vietnamese, Korean groceries, and of course in Indian groceries. There's also black radish. Black radish is a larger root vegetable, and it has a very strong pungent flavor. You can also juice it, and it's a very intense and cleansing juice. But again, we're sticking with the Ayurvedic perspective. It's better to have it steamed. But these are all pungent vegetables, and if someone is trying to balance kapha, these pungent vegetables are going to be kapha pacifying. So pungent vegetables are going to be good for someone who wants to pacify kapha. They will tend to be a little bit vata aggravating, and in excess they can be severely aggravating for pitta. For example, I'm pitta kapha, and I can tolerate a small amount of onions if there's a lot of onions and things, and this will be true. Sometimes, Indian restaurants they cook Mughalai food, which is not really Indian food. It's more of the mixture of Persian and Afghan cooking that came into India during the time of the Mughal invasion. Traditional Indian cooking is a bit more like South Indian cooking, and things like dal and rice. The Mughalai cooking tends to use a lot of oil, a lot of onions, a lot of rich things like cashew paste and cream, and that is not recommended in Ayurveda. So just a word on that. When we talk about Ayurvedic cooking, we're really talking about, we're really trying to stick to ancient recipes, and it's really not the same as the Mughlai cuisine. I'll spell that out. So Mughlai is not equal to ancient Indian, and which is also Ayurvedic cooking. Okay. Yeah, so if you have that, if I have that, it can cause some indigestion, and it can cause some acid reflux, and it can also lead sometimes to some diarrhea. Diarrhea sometimes results from aggravation of pitta. So these pungent vegetables are going to be very good for kapha. They're okay for vata and pitta in smaller amounts. If someone has a very high vata, you want to really try to avoid the pungent vegetables, or if the pitta is very, very high. Also, there are some pungent vegetables like mooli and the mooli. So mooli, if you haven't seen the mooli or daikon, it's a large white radish, meaning it's about the size of an eggplant. So, usually they're anywhere from about 1.5 to 3 inches in diameter, and they can be easily 10 to 12 inches long. So a single, and they also sometimes are sold with the greens attached. And sometimes you cook these in a vegetable, and they're very tasty, but they may be a little hard to digest sometimes for someone who has a high pitta. It's just something that you have to find out and see how that works. Cooking can help reduce the pungent quality in some pungent vegetables. For example, small green onions are mildly pungent. I can have more of those, for example, being a little onion sensitive. Not really a problem. They are just not as pungent as other things. So if you want to give the pungent things to vata or vata kapha, you can cook something like small green onions and add a small amount of cayenne pepper, or even better than using cayenne pepper, use black pepper. Black pepper has a more balancing heat if you're trying to make something warming. So let's talk about the nightshades. Some examples of nightshade family vegetables are tomatoes, eggplant or aubergine, depending on where you're from, potatoes. These are all nightshade family. So they have some things in common. They are all somewhat kapha increasing, and they are a little bit kapha increasing, and they will tend to be vata and pitta pacifying. But in excess, especially with sour tomatoes, it may be pitta aggravating. Now, you want to avoid sour tomatoes for pitta. Sour tomatoes actually can be used. There's a type of chutney, and it's made from green tomatoes. I think we may have a cooking video that highlights that. But if you have, the only way to get that really is if you're growing tomatoes in the backyard. You can harvest them when they're still green, and you can cut them up and cook them. and when they're cooked, they're a little sour, and you balance that by adding some gur or a little bit of raw sugar, and you use spices, a lot of turmeric and ginger, and you add some astringency, and cumin, black cumin also is used in that. And it's a it's a condiment, but it can be a bit aggravating to have too much of the nightshade family. Now, these all build dhatus. They're very good for anemic people because these nightshade family vegetables build rasa dhatu. And the rasa dhatu building ability is why they're not good for kapha, because kapha persons already have too much rasa dhatu. So what are the two components of kapha? Kapha is earth and water. So when you're increasing rasa dhatu too much, it's going to be somewhat imbalancing for kapha. Now, there are persons who have nightshade allergies. And of course, in that case, it's contraindicated. And if somebody has sensitivity, so if someone is suffering from celiac disease, irritable bowel syndrome, or whatever, these are good things to avoid. You can just drop them. They don't have to be on the diet. Some people in India, they follow a vrat or a dietary restriction of basically cutting out everything in the nightshade family, except maybe potatoes, for 4 months out of the year. It's just done as a a type of austerity, but the point is that you can pretty much live without nightshade family vegetables. And sometimes, if they are triggering sensitivities, there are things that can be done to help reduce. So these should be well cooked. If there's a triggering of allergies, it's possible that we're having things not properly cooked. I can count, sometimes we end up eating out, and that's not the best choice. That's not the best preference, but sometimes it's hard to avoid, especially if you're traveling, for example. And I can count on one hand the number of times that I'll have eggplant that's cooked properly. Lebanese cooking has a way of preparing eggplant that's very similar to an Indian way of cooking, where that gets roasted really thoroughly on coals and then mashed up, and they make baba ganoush that way. But eggplant actually requires a lot of cooking. And if eggplant is still a little bit chewy, it's definitely not cooked right. And also, if eggplant is not cooked properly, it'll tend to give you that kind of scratchy feeling in your mouth. That's because it's not cooked right. If it's cooked right, it should be pleasant. Some eggplant can be a little sharp tasting. There are some varieties of eggplant that have less of that kind of sharp, irritating taste. So, for example, if you're getting these American Black Beauty eggplants and you cook them and you find that it's a bit irritating, you might also try, there are these little round Indian eggplants. They're kind of, egg-shaped. And there's the Japanese or Chinese eggplant, they're sometimes called. They're long and thin. And those are actually much milder. They don't have that kind of sharp, itchy quality that the large purple eggplants sometimes have. Other contraindications for nightshades, if there is currently ama, if someone is getting over an infection, or if someone has allergies, nightshades can cause allergies to flare up, and they can also increase ama. So these would be good times to just skip over the nightshades. Use other things. Use cruciferous vegetables. Use root vegetables. Use leafy vegetables. There are other options. Okay. Okay, and let's talk about diuretics. So what are some of the diuretic vegetables? Carrots and celery. Celery in small amounts because it has salt, it has sodium. Lettuce, mustard greens, watercress, broccoli, and then there are some varieties of potatoes, the fingerling and blue potatoes. These have a natural diuretic effect. They will tend to reduce rasa dhatu. They will tend to reduce water. These are naturally kapha reducing, so they're good at reducing rasa dhatu. But because they are also a little sweet, you might not use these diuretic potato varieties for kapha. You want to have them cooked or steamed. And for a vata, these will reduce water. So you want to make sure that the person is making up for water loss in other ways, like drinking warm water and teas. Vata persons are going to have a tendency toward dryness. Vata persons may have a tendency toward dry skin, and they also they're not going to have as much fatty tissue reserves as kapha or kapha pitta or pitta, and they will definitely need to make sure that if they're having diuretic vegetables that they are getting enough water to make up for what they may lose, because diuretics are going to make you urinate more. They may also cause you to sweat a little bit more, and your body will tend to get rid of whatever water it's holding on to. So what are some vegetables for dual doshas? So what are vegetables that are pacifying for pitta kapha and aggravating for vata? Cabbage, cauliflower, celery, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, lettuce, bell pepper, asparagus, mushroom, peas, alfalfa sprouts, and artichoke. These are all going to be balancing for pitta kapha. What about vata kapha? In that case, cooked and steamed spinach, mustard greens, parsley, cilantro, green onions, ginger root, turmeric root. Avocado will tend to be vata balancing, and it will tend to be somewhat kapha aggravating, so maybe a little bit less of that. Some others, vata pitta. What are vata pitta balancing? Squash, sweet potatoes, sea vegetables. And there are a lot of sea vegetables that are available, often in dried form. Dulse, nori, kuzu, but some of these only in small amounts for pitta. They also tend to sometimes be high in sodium and other things. Sea vegetables are much easier to get than they used to be. You can sometimes get them in dried form, and they can be a good supplement to have. Finally, what about the things that are pitta balancing? Coconut, mint, cilantro. Cilantro would be a great thing to have every day for pitta. Cucumber, cool as a cucumber. This is something that we subscribe to in Ayurveda as well. And eggplant. Eggplant is also going to be pitta balancing. But again, if you have allergies, if there is a problem with ama buildup, avoid eggplant, or also possibly stick with eggplant varieties. Because I personally know how to cook eggplant, and I can cook the American style, the Black Beauty eggplant, and make it come out pretty well. But if I have a choice, I will prefer to get the Chinese eggplant. They're usually kind of a lightish purple, and the fruits are kind of long and skinny. So I always will prefer those over the really big Black Beauty eggplants. Okay, so that's it. That's going to be in the next lecture. Sea vegetables in general, I would say you want to keep it in kind of moderate amounts for pitta. It's, all sea vegetables. So sea vegetables in general. They all tend to have They all are a bit salty. Pittas are, you know, just like kapha persons may sometimes tend to crave sweets, pitta persons will also sometimes crave things that are salty and things that will sometimes aggravate pitta. So part of finding balance in Ayurveda is finding satisfaction with things that are balancing for us and not not going with our tendencies to indulge ourselves in the things that aren't really good for us. So yeah, sea vegetables, in moderation for pitta. It's less of, less of an issue for vata persons. So I'm going to, I don't know how we're doing on time. Let's see. I have a cooking video. Yeah, it is a lot of information, but we'd like to get you started and get you thinking about it. So I have one video here that I'm going to play that is on cooking vegetables, and there's a few of these. So this is this is one playlist on Ayurvedic cooking. And I'm going to play one of these. Oops, I meant to send that to everyone. There we go. So I'm going to play one of these. And I have to get the... Do you hear the narration there? So this is cooking eggplant. Let me know if you can hear the video. You can just type that in the chat. So this is cutting eggplant. And you can see this is I'm cutting it in very small pieces. All right, so the sound is just a little low. And that's as high as the audio is going to go on that. So basically, so I'm heating up, so you can see the pan there. I'm heating up some ghee there, and I have whole spices in there. And we've already cut up the eggplant in small pieces. When you cook eggplant, you're going to need to use more oil. Eggplant is kind of like a sponge. So when you put eggplant in a little bit of oil and you try to pan fry it, suddenly, what happened to the oil? It all got sucked up. And you might have to add a little bit more. Now you see I've got the eggplant, it's kind of simmering, it's pan frying. And it's going to take a little bit of time, and it wants to have some heat. So I've added some warming spices there. I've added a little bit of coriander powder and a little bit of cinnamon. I've added some warming spices. And hing is also very important. So I've got these spices in there, and I'm stirring this around a little bit. And it's going to cook for a little while. You want to not be in a hurry. So now I've got a lid on there, and I've got a decent amount of heat, and that's going to continue cooking All right, so now this is a different saute. This was from a cooking workshop that we did some years ago. Let's see, now there was another one here. All right, so I'm going to stop that one for now. I think that this is probably a good time for us to end. I would recommend go through some of these cooking videos, think about the, the principles. What I really want you to do, don't just make up a recipe book and slavishly copy these things. Try some of these techniques, try some of these things, and think about the principle behind it. Think about how we are trying to come up with something that's balancing. We're trying to balance the doshas. We're trying to balance on the principle of Panchamahabhuta. That's what I really want you to think of. Think about the, okay, here's an eggplant. What is the eggplant? Well, it's got some water and it's a little fiery. And or here's a zucchini. The zucchini is a very light vegetable. It's really very tridoshic. It's very mild, and it really agrees with just about everyone. Or here's a tomato. Tomato is it has a little bit of sourness, a little bit of sweetness to it. Or here's a potato. The potato is very earthy. So, think about things from that perspective, and also look at the techniques that are used and how we can transform the nature of different vegetables with cooking techniques and also with use of spices. All right, so I'm going to pause recording. You can just take a really short break. I'm just going to check and see what's going to be the next stage here today. And we'll just take a 2-minute break here, okay?